Hello friends, welcome to my channel. This is my first ever YouTube video. I don't know, intros are hard.
Welcome to my channel. I don't feel like finding royalty-free music. Welcome to my channel.
Today we're going to talk about the foundations of yoga, where we break down common early class poses into their very detailed safety and stability cues that you might not get in a normal class. My name is Bellamy Linneman, sometimes Goose, depending on how you know me, and I am a mental health therapist, I am a yoga teacher, I also do counselor training, and I really want to make real self-care more accessible to more people, so that's why I started this YouTube channel. And I made this video specifically because I've noticed that a lot of yoga instructors really don't cue a lot of basic foundational kind of safety things in their regular classes. Because it wasn't really until I did my yoga teacher training that I started to understand, oh, right, this is how I might orient my body in this particular pose. This is why I was feeling wrist pain, or this is why I felt like I wasn't building strength in the way that I wanted to. And so instead of you having to pay thousands of dollars and spend 200 hours of your time to become a yoga teacher, you can watch this video instead for free. So for today's video, I'm breaking down easy seat or sukhasana and mountain pose or tadasana. And I hope to continue this series where I'll do tabletop and down dog in another video and even break down poses further than that later on. But before I get into the pose cueing, I want to look into why it's important to learn, why more instructors aren't focusing on this. If you're not interested in this, feel free to skip ahead. I think I'm going to put timestamps in the video. I don't know how to do that, but that's a problem for later, Bellamy. So why might an instructor not give detailed safety cueing? Safety is super important, so why wouldn't they cue it? Really, the biggest reason is just time. You'll see as I get to these poses, even something like easy seat can really have a long, detailed list of cues to do. So when, at least the way I was trained, teachers think about getting folks into the shape, right? So sit on your butts, cross your legs, tall spine, you're in the shape of easy seat. And then we have safety or stability cues, right? So that might be like engage your core, shoulders down and back. And then we might have a comfort cue where we say breathe to lengthen, inhale, exhale to soften, right? So those are kind of the three components of a pose. You do shape, safety / stability, and comfort. Even just the ones that I gave you, that already can take a really long time. So there is no tea or shade to instructors who don't do a lot of this detailed cueing. Other reasons is maybe the instructor teaches a more advanced class. I attend advanced yoga classes where they kind of expect you to know how to do a down dog. They may offer corrections if they see someone doing something in a way that might hurt themselves. But the point of that class is really not to look at building fundamentals. The assumption is that the fundamentals are already built. And also, some teachers may just maybe never learn certain safety cues. You know, there are certain teaching cues that have shifted over the years. One that was taught when I was taking yoga several years ago was that we want to go from a high plank and just lower straight down. And then people noticed rotator cuff injuries from that. So now we teach it differently, right? Where you bring the shoulders forward and then you go down. And so even if someone had the best program ever, things may have changed over the years, maybe they haven't heard of. So the goal of this video is not to shame yoga teachers who don't include these cues. It's not to shame anyone who has heard these cues, but they don't incorporate them into their practice. I just want folks to have this as a resource to boost their current practice, build good habits, and fill in the gaps that their classes might not be able to fill. Hi! Do you want to come on video? Can we see you? Hi, stinky boy. Hello, come here. I have been joined by my cat Kenobi. He's a sweet baby. So, why does it matter? Why do we care about the foundations of yoga poses? Well, first and foremost, we want our practice to be safe. If we don't have a firm, oh my gosh, this is so hard to record. Look at this baby, okay? Look at him. I don't know if you can see him. I hope you can. If we don't have a firm understanding of our foundations, we can cause injury over time. I just mentioned just that slight thing about moving the shoulders slightly over the wrists, ahead of the wrists, can prevent rotator cuff injuries. But also, we are not going to develop as much strength and flexibility if we're not engaging in these foundational cues. So foundational cueing supports joint health and helps us increase our strength and flexibility. So if you find that you're frequently experiencing wrist pain, low back pain, instability when you're in balancing poses, you feel like you just aren't building strength and flexibility in ways that you are hoping to in your yoga practice, this video might be for you. The second reason we want to focus on our foundational cues is to make sure that we're developing good habits from the start. So if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend checking out this video because it is really hard to correct something that has become habit, especially something that's like body memory. But even if you have been doing yoga for a long time, I still recommend watching this video because you might hear something that you maybe haven't heard in other places that could really help deepen your practice. The last reason that we want to focus on our foundations is because these foundations build up to basically every other yoga pose you could ever do. So when you learn how to create a stable tabletop pose or mountain pose, you can actually apply those to other more complicated poses in your practice. And for most of us, it's easier to learn the basics of a pose when we're in something that's less strenuous, right? Trying to learn how to engage your core in, tree pose might feel really hard because you're balancing and there's so much extra stuff happening. So if we can break it down in these early class poses that tend to ask less of us, it allows our attention then to come to more of this detailed and nuanced cueing. It's basically like having training wheels on your bike. So that is what we're doing today, learning these fundamentals so we can be more safe, we can have more strength and flexibility, and we can learn the building blocks to all of the other poses, maybe more advanced poses that we would like to call into our practice in the future. All right, so we'll start with easy seat today, or sukhasana. And I want to break down the Sanskrit meaning of these poses just so we can get an idea of maybe what we could be looking to experience in a pose. I will say I am not an expert in Sanskrit, so, I've done my best, I've done my research, but I'm certainly not an expert on interpreting Sanskrit and how we can apply it to yoga. So this is just my own personal interpretation. Please feel free to let me know if you have other interpretations in the comments. All right, so moving on to the Sanskrit translation, sukh is often translated as comfortable, and asana means pose. So we can think about this as comfortable pose. Other folks translate this as easy seat, but this might not feel easy or comfortable for a lot of people. And I think part of that is because, at least in America, where I'm from, we don't do a lot of floor sitting beyond elementary school, and sitting cross-legged or crisscross applesauce, it really demands a lot of flexibility in the hips. We have to have core engagement. There's a lot of different things happening. So if this doesn't feel comfortable for you, I hope that you find some of these cues helpful. And even if the pose is not easy, maybe we can find some comfort despite challenges. So this is what easy seat may look like if we're not engaging our foundational cues. It tends to be pretty collapsed. None of my muscles are really actively engaged. You can see my spine is really rounded. Curtis Connor likes to call this the C-spine. And some people sometimes feel pinching at the hips here. And the other option of this could be like a really rigid, tall, I am very engaged muscularly, but in a way that doesn't feel very comfortable. I'm like a pencil. And we want to find a version of this that it maybe blends those two together. So here's what we'll do as a starter. For most of us, we're going to want to actually sit on a prop. That might look like grabbing a block, a blanket, or a bolster. If you're practicing from home and you don't have a blanket, you can use a towel. So I'll show a couple different options. If you use a yoga blanket, fuck you, Cuban. So in most studios, we consider this the default setting. This is how most blankets are folded when you show up. You can just fold it hot dog style. I'm having hot dogs for dinner tonight. I'm very excited. And you have a thicker blanket. And if we use blocks, I typically don't recommend sitting on top of 2 blocks. That can feel really, really tall in a cross-legged seat and maybe a little unstable because the blocks can like tilt forward. I would recommend, if you want this much height, to sit on a bolster and then maybe stack a couple of blankets on top. You could also sit on a block if you don't have a bolster at home and stack your blanket over top. But ultimately, if you find sitting on 2 blocks feels good, it doesn't feel tall, it doesn't feel unstable, go for that. If you would like to sit on 1 block, you'll just bring it under the butt. Or on 1 block. Some folks who have more flesh on their butts like to bring 1 block per butt cheek. That's also an option that you can play around with. That actually feels like really nice. Okay. I'm glad I played around with that. And so if you're taking that option, the blocks will just be at their lowest height and the short ends are kissing. I'll demo this with a bath towel because a lot of you might not have access to blankets or props. So this is just a regular bath towel. It's pretty plush, so it's already pretty thick. We can see that here, and that's really what we want. You could bring your bath towel to this thickness. You might fold it over 1 more time, get a little extra thickness. We're just folding it hot dog style. And I'll place that underneath my butt. Now, you'll notice our knees are slightly closer to the ground, or maybe more than slightly closer to the ground, depending on how high our prop is. And this might help reduce some of the pinching you might feel. If your easy seat, your knees are really, really high up, when you elevate your hips, it creates a little bit more space for those hips to open. It reduces the strain of gravity pulling on the knees and might help this just feel a little more open. I love to cue scooting the hips all the way to the edge of your prop until you feel like you're really on the edge of your seat, like quite literally like in a movie. You're on the edge of your seat. And your pelvis sort of tilts forward. Like if it's your pelvis is a bowl, we're just tilting that bowl forward like we're about to pour out some water. Some folks will cue where you're further back on your prop. There's just different options here. I find especially the higher you go, the more comfortable it might feel to come to the edge of your prop. So we're on the edge of our prop. Our feet are crossed. The other thing I really love about this scooting the pelvis forward so it tilts is that it forces the low back to have a natural curvature, right? So when we stand naturally, there's always a curve at the low part of the spine. And in most yoga poses, at least from the way I was taught, we want to maintain the natural curvature of the back even when we're twisted in like weird different ways, with the exception being maybe like a forward fold, right? So in this pose, when we scoop the pelvis forward, it keeps this low back slightly curved. And then it also, for me, begins to force me to engage my core muscles a little bit more. And when we have our core engaged, our pelvis forward, it's hopefully going to help maintaining this pose feel less strenuous because we are more engaged. It might feel more effortful, but maybe we'll feel a little more relaxing the more used to it we get. So when we move up the spine, we can think about engaging our core, not by sucking in. Sucking in, I can't really talk because I'm literally holding my breath. We want to be able to breathe through these poses. So instead of like sucking the belly in or flexing where we're really tensing the muscles, we can think about pulling with our muscles belly towards center. So I'll show you a side view. There's a pretty big dramatic change as I go from my neutral kind of level of engagement, the natural engagement of my core, versus very intentional. Right, we go from here all the way. That's a lot of space. There's like several inches of space there. Another way I like to think about this is hugging the rib cage up and in. And the reason I love this rib cage cue is because it gets our side abdominals engaged as well as our front, right? So we're really using all of this wonderful lumbar support to be nice, engaged, and tall. And you may notice that when you engage your abdominals, you already kind of have a little more length. So we'll just bring even more length into the back. So if you're rounding the upper part of the spine, we just straighten and lengthen. We think about maybe the sternum pulls slightly forward and up. And then we can inhale those shoulders up. Exhale, shoulders down and back. Now, a lot of folks, when they get to this part of practice, can have a really rigid. This is where we talked about the opposite of the round is the very rigid, easy seat. So we'll just inhale into the chest and exhale. Allow that exhale to just soften the space between the shoulder blades. Soften those shoulders down. Hands can come to knees, face up, face down. Some folks might cue this with fingertips on the mat. I like to have my hands on my knees. Hands on my knees, hands on my knees. I have ADHD. And then we'll think about lifting the chin slightly, gaze comes forward. We'll pull the head slightly back in space, pull the ears back in space. And this is our very engaged, easy seat. We can even get more engaged if we press the feet, the toes into the mat. This is not something I typically do, but here we are. And yeah, this is really strong. I hope it feels stable, but I also hope that you have some looseness to this posture. Now you can let that go. For me, my natural way of sitting is to round completely. And I'll invite you to come into sukhasana, easy seat like you normally would. So maybe we remove any props we're sitting on. And if your easy seat is normally rounded, or if it's normally really rigid, let go of all the cues we just did and experience what this pose is like. Notice any new sensations that maybe weren't there the first time. And then I'll cue us quickly back into this since we've already done this once. We'll come to sit on our props. So hips scoot to the edge of our prop so the pelvis tilts forward. We'll engage the core. We can think of hugging those ribs up and in. Lengthen through the spine. Maybe the sternum reaches slightly. Shoulders down and back. Palms come to the knees or the thighs. We'll draw the head back slightly as the gaze lifts. Chin lifts slightly. Pull the ears back slightly in space. And we can think about an invisible string pulling through the top of our head. We lengthen. The head moves away from the hips. The hips root into the ground. And take a few breaths here, really keeping this engagement in the core. Maybe you get engagement in the toes, maybe not. You can root through those pinky toes. And just breathe into the sensations that you're experiencing. Notice differences, notice similarities. And you can let that go. Now, you don't have to be fully locked the fuck in every time you come into this pose. But when you know what the more engaged version of a pose feels like, then you have options. You can choose to have a really engaged easy seat, or you can choose to have a less engaged easy seat. And it really just empowers you to choose. There's also a really great option with the strap that I'm not going to cover today, but maybe I'll do another video on that can help with posture correction. So stay tuned for that. But with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our next pose. The next pose we'll take a look at is mountain pose or tadasana. And to break down the Sanskrit of the pose, tada means mountain and asana means pose. So we are really invoking the energy and stability of a strong and stable mountain here. The reason I'm pairing easy seat with mountain pose is because from the hips up, there are very similar cues that you'll Noodle. Noodle, stop that. That's bad. She's trying to destroy my eagle sign. Fucking rude. So the initial cues might feel a little bit different, but as we go on, you'll begin to see how this builds upon easy seat, and hopefully how these cues might build into other poses in your practice as well. Now, your tadasana might look like this. I'm doing like a very exaggerated Shaggy from Scooby-Doo doing tadasana, I guess. So your feet might be pointing in opposite directions. If you can't tell, my shoulders are really rounded. And when I round my shoulder, it like sticks my pelvis forward. Not a lot of engagement happening here. I notice some tension in my low back because of how my posture is situated. Conversely, your tadasana might look like this. So it could be really strong, but like really rigid. My shoulders are like hiked back. I'm pretty uncomfortable here, to be honest. And yeah, this doesn't feel great. So we want to try to find a balance between, you know, an exaggerated Shaggy and like a rigid, you know, straight line like a pencil. And that's what I'm going to teach you how to do. If you're not standing already, come to stand. And I don't do free feet pics on the internet, so I'm going to put someone else's foot on screen to demonstrate what I'm about to talk about. Even though you can see my feet on screen, it's fine. I feel totally comfortable about it. So in our mountain pose, we typically want feet parallel, pointing forward. And so when our feet are parallel, they're both pointing in the same direction forward. And if you're someone whose feet naturally point out in opposite directions, it might feel really unnatural to have feet forward. I do plan on having my physical therapist friend who explained really nicely how to tell if this is something that your body's natural alignment wants to do, so it's more comfortable and maybe you can keep doing it, versus something that you want to try to train maybe to change. But they're not here right now, so I'll have her on in a later episode. But for now, most of us are going to have our toes pointing forward. Feet are parallel. We also want them to be about hips width distance. You can bring them a little bit wider if that feels more comfortable, so you can play around there. And just know that there are certain instructors that will cue Tadasana with feet together, so the inner edges of the feet touch. And I've heard that for people who are assigned female at birth, like myself, actually our anatomy prefers feet hips width distance. So really play around and know that there is no right or wrong way to get into this pose. It's really just a matter of what feels good for your body. All right, so our feet are parallel. They're about hips width distance. And we'll take a look at the inner edge of the foot and the outer edge of the foot. I've heard some people cue the foot with 3 points of focus. I like to cue it really thinking about the foot being broken into 4 parts. So on the inner edge of the foot, we have the big toe mound, and then we have the inner edge of the heel. On the outer edge of the foot, we have the pinky toe mound and the outer edge of the heel. So we can actually play around with the sensation to figure out what these are. And notice when I say toe mound, we're talking about the ball of the foot, not like the actual toes. So move side to side, really get a feel for what it feels like to overcorrect one direction and the other. And then we can move forward onto the balls of the feet, so the heels lift. We can move back onto the heels, maybe the toes lift. And then we'll bring ourselves to center and see if that overcorrection in those ways can help you find what feels more balanced and centered. And then we'll think about pressing through the big toe mound, the pinky toe mound, press through the inner edge of the foot and the outer edge of the foot. Once you've done that, we'll lift the toes and spread them nice and wide. This will help us make sure we're really rooted on the feet and not sinking forward. And then we can press those toes into the mat and maybe grip like we're trying to crunch the mat underneath. And while we grip, we press the toes away. And we're like super actively engaged in our feet. I don't even normally cue the toes like this. And I notice in my body, with this engagement of the feet, I'm already like much more active in my legs and upper body as well. Working our way up the body, we'll bring our attention to the knees. And for the way I was taught yoga, for the way that I teach yoga, I always cue a micro bend in our joints. It's very rare that I cue locking our joints out. There are certain styles that might call for that. There are certain types of exercise that call for that. If you do kettlebells, they want your knees to lock. But for today's practice, for the way I cue mountain pose, a micro bend to the knees. We'll then engage the thighs. And we're not flexing or squeezing them. It's more so pulling them slightly up. We can think about like hugging them up, which will cause the kneecaps to rise. We then engage the glutes, so pull the butt towards our pelvis. And as we have this engagement, we naturally tuck our tailbone. So I'll show you what that looks like from the side. This is untucked. There's an exaggerated curvature to my low back. This is tucked. So we pull the thighs up, hug the butt in, and then the last thing is tuck this tailbone the last little bit that it needs to go. So it's like pulling it down and forward. We have that engagement. And by the way, we're still keeping the feet engaged, the toes, the knees, the thighs, right? So once we've got that, we'll move up to the core. And this is where it gets very similar to easy seat. We hug the core towards center. And again, there are different practices and lineages that might cue this differently. For the way I was trained, for the kind of yoga that I practice, teach, and have in my area, this is what we're looking at. So we'll pull the core towards center. Again, I like to think of pulling my rib cage up and in. All right, we're pulling in from the sides, from front to back. And then we'll inhale those shoulders up and exhale them back. Here we can think about the sternum shining forward. And then we'll inhale into the chest. Exhale. Let that relax. Have a little bit of gentleness and ease so we're not wrenching our shoulders back. Palms traditionally face forward in Tadasana. From an anatomical perspective, I notice it gives me a little bit more space in the shoulders, but like it's such a minute difference that you can really play around with what feels good for you. Last thing here, we can maybe lift the chin slightly so the gaze is forward. Pull the head slightly back in space. Pull the ears back in space. And we are really solid in our Tadasana. I just had to re-engage my feet because I forgot about them. So we'll take a couple breaths here, just noticing this really solid engagement. Might feel really challenging to maintain all of this at the same time. Maybe we think of that invisible string pulling us taller, taller, taller. So the head pulls away from the hips. The tailbone, the hips root into the earth. We get so much length. And exhale, settling into this posture. And then I invite you to come into your usual Tadasana. So if you're more of like the shaggy, ooh, I noticed some not great pulling in my shoulders when I do that. If you're more of the pencil, come into that posture just for a few breaths and notice what that feels like for you. So we'll come back into our Tadasana. I'll cue it pretty quickly now that we've been in it before. Inner, outer edges of those feet, toes press into the mat. We have a micro bend in the knees, thighs engage, butt hugs towards center. We tuck the tail, engage our core, hug towards center. Shoulders are down and back. Maybe the sternum has a slight lift to it. Palms face forward or towards yourself. We lift the chin slightly as the gaze comes forward. We pull the head slightly back in space. Pull the ears slightly back in space. Breathe through so much length as we reach through the crown of the head. We're in a very stable Tadasana. And here, just notice what's different. What feels different from your less engaged or overly engaged Tadasana to this maybe more balanced Tadasana, if we might want to call it that. Great job, everybody. So, We've reviewed why it's important to learn the foundations of early class poses, and we've gone over very detailed foundational cueing for easy seat, sukhasana, and mountain pose, tadasana. I started with these two poses because they are, all things considered, probably the least effort that we might put into a pose. They're stationary, there's no balancing involved. So they're a really great place for us to learn how to engage our core, to breathe while engaging our core. And these are the building blocks for almost every other pose in yoga. Next, I'll be moving on to tabletop and down dog, which will really focus on hand placement and hand engagement to protect the wrists. So with these 4 poses, you're basically going to be set for almost everything. I have another kitty. I don't know if you all can see her. So if what I went over today felt new to you, I recommend practicing these, maybe a few times a day. You could just spend 5 minutes sitting in easy seat and then move to tadasana. You could practice your core and shoulder alignment when you're sitting in a chair or watching TV. So there's a lot of different ways to practice these. You could also even just focus on different elements. Maybe you take a yoga class and you focus on your toes throughout the whole class, right, in tadasana. So there's a lot of different ways to engage with this. You could do these once a week for the rest of your life. I don't care. But practicing with these, getting familiar, and eventually, and probably faster than you think, this will become second nature. So once you feel like you've got these poses down, your spine is really strong, you're like, I don't even got to think about it, I'm just actively engaged, head over to my second video, which may or may not be up by the time you watch this. Who knows, where I talk about, again, tabletop and downward facing dog, where we'll really focus on the spinal alignment, hip alignment, wrist hand engagement, and yeah, then you'll be pretty much set for everything. In the meantime, please feel free to like and subscribe for more mental health and yoga content. And let me know in the comments what cues today were helpful for you. And let me know if I missed any cues. If there are any cues you have heard from your teachers or things that work for your body. If you are a teacher, things that you love to cue in these poses. I would love to hear from everyone and deepen my own understanding. And yeah, I guess now I have to end the video somehow. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna go to a preseason Eagles football game. Bye. My image may match my M&Ms. Oh my.